You're 8 years old. The world is supposed to be simple. Cartoons, school, bikes on the sidewalk, afternoons that feel endless. But on a cool April afternoon in 1988, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, that simplicity shattered when a little girl named April Tinsley walked out of her friend's house and vanished. For nearly 3 decades, her disappearance would grip an entire community, not just because of the brutality of what happened, but because her killer refused to stay silent. He taunted the police, the families, even the children of the city, leaving behind messages that felt like something out of a horror movie. And for the longest time, it seemed like he would never be found. But this story doesn't end in the past. It ends with something no one imagined in the 1980s, modern science reaching back through time to drag a hidden killer into the light. This is the kind of case that keeps investigators awake at night. The kind that haunts small towns. The kind that makes parents lock the doors twice. And it all begins on a day that should have been ordinary. April Tinsley was described by her family as sweet, smart, and a little shy. She loved dolls, playing with her friends, and doing the little things 8-year-olds do. On April 1st, 1988, she went to a friend's home in her neighborhood like she'd done before. Nothing unusual. Nothing dangerous. When she stepped outside to walk home, it was just a short distance. Far less than a block. But somewhere on that walk, someone saw her. And someone acted. When April didn't come home, her mother, Janet, immediately sensed something was wrong. This wasn't a child who wandered off. This wasn't a child who forgot the time. Police were called instantly, and within hours, the neighborhood became a swarm of activity. Officers, search teams, neighbors yelling her name. People drove up and down the streets looking everywhere. Kids were pulled inside their homes. Parents stood guard at windows. But April wasn't found that night. 3 days later, on April 4th, a jogger noticed something in a ditch beside a rural road about 20 miles from Fort Wayne. It was the body of a small girl. The clothing matched the description. It was April. The innocence of her life had been replaced by a violent, senseless act. Autopsy results confirmed what the community already feared. April had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The shock was immediate. The fear was overwhelming. And the question every parent whispered was the same. Who would do something like this? Police launched a massive investigation. They interviewed more than 100 potential suspects. They followed every lead, searched abandoned buildings, talked to people who lived nearby, questioned known offenders, examined vehicles, and tried to piece together April's last movements. But in the pre-DNA era, true forensic science was limited. There were clues, yes, but not enough to point to a single person. Still, the killer had left behind one crucial piece of evidence: DNA. But in 1988, that evidence couldn't identify anyone unless their DNA was already in a criminal database. And whoever took April wasn't. Years passed. The case went cold. And for most cold cases, that's where the story ends. A family left grieving. A community left with unanswered questions. A case file slowly gathering dust in a back office. But this case wasn't done. Not even close. 6 years after April's murder, on May 21, 1990, police found something that changed everything. It was a message, written in black marker on a barn door. A message so disturbing it didn't feel real. It said, "I kill 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley. I will kill again." Someone had claimed responsibility. Someone wanted attention. Someone wanted control. But the message didn't lead to an arrest. Investigators couldn't be sure if it was the killer or a cruel prank. The handwriting wasn't enough to identify anyone. And again, the case drifted back into silence. But the silence wouldn't last long. 14 years after that message, in 2004, children in Fort Wayne began finding handwritten notes, and even more horrifying, used condoms, left in mailboxes and on bicycles. These weren't random messages. They were addressed to little girls. Some notes claimed the writer had killed April and was watching the children he targeted. On one note, the writer warned, "I am the same person that kidnapped and murdered April Tinsley." Another note said he was going to kill again. The handwriting matched the barn message from 1990. DNA from the condoms matched the DNA from April's case in 1988. This was the moment the police realized something chilling. The killer had never left. He had stayed in the area. He had continued stalking, lurking, watching. He had sent threats to little girls, deliberately terrorizing the community for decades. He wasn't hiding, he was playing a twisted game. But despite the new evidence, investigators still couldn't find a match in any criminal database. No fingerprints, no suspect whose DNA connected, no confession, nothing. And so, again, the years rolled on. And every time the case resurfaced online, people asked the same painful question. How could someone do this, taunt a city for decades, and get away with it? By 2018, the case was 30 years old. For most investigations, that would feel like a dead end. But that year, something new entered the world of criminal forensics, genetic genealogy. A technique that could take DNA from a crime scene and compare it to public ancestry databases, looking for distant relatives of the killer. Once you found a relative, you could build a family tree and eventually narrow it down to a suspect. It was the same method that caught the Golden State Killer. And in April Tinsley's case, it would do the same. Investigators uploaded the killer's DNA to a genealogy site and got a hit. Not a direct match, but a family connection. From that, detectives built a family tree leading to two brothers who lived in Indiana. One of them had to be the killer. Detectives began surveillance on the man they believed matched the profile. A quiet, reclusive factory worker named John D. Miller. He lived alone, kept to himself, and his house was exactly 10 minutes from where April was taken. Police needed one more thing, fresh DNA. So they followed Miller and collected used trash he threw away, specifically items with his biological material. The DNA was tested, and the results were undeniable. It matched the crime scene. 30 years after April was murdered, her killer was finally identified. But how do you approach the man responsible for a crime that haunted an entire generation? The detectives went to Miller's house. They knocked on the door, and when he opened it, they asked one simple question. "Do you know why we're here?" Miller looked at them, paused, and said, "April Tinsley." He confessed immediately, and what he said stunned even seasoned investigators. He admitted he had abducted April, assaulted her, killed her, dumped her body, and then, for decades, he had continued fantasizing and writing messages, sending notes to children, keeping the horror alive because, in his own words, he couldn't stop thinking about it. A community that had waited 30 years finally got justice. April's family finally got answers, and a monster who believed. The moment John D. Miller spoke April's name out loud, something shifted in the room. Detectives later said it felt like the air itself changed, like the truth had been hiding behind a closed door for 30 years, and suddenly it swung open. Miller didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't deny anything. He didn't pretend to be confused. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, or maybe running from it for so long that he finally gave up. But what he told investigators next revealed just how calculated he had been. He described how he had driven around that April afternoon in 1988 looking for someone vulnerable. He wasn't hunting an adult. He wasn't looking for a teenager. He was searching specifically for a child. He admitted he saw April walking alone near her home. A moment that lasted only seconds but determined the rest of her life. He pulled over. She didn't scream. She didn't run. He told detectives she simply looked at him with confusion, and then fear, as he forced her into his vehicle. That detail, the quiet shock of a little girl who didn't understand what was happening, stuck with one detective for years. He later said in interviews, "It was the calmness in his voice that was hard to listen to. There was no remorse. Just a man explaining something he did like he was describing how to fix a broken lawnmower." But the horror didn't end with the confession. For decades, Miller had lived a seemingly quiet life. Neighbors described him as odd but harmless. He kept to himself, rarely interacted with anyone, and worked repetitive jobs that didn't require social contact. Nothing about him outwardly screamed danger. He wasn't the stereotypical monster lurking in shadows. He was the type who blended in so well that no one looked at him twice. The contrast between who he appeared to be and what he had done made the case even more unsettling. This wasn't a man who committed a crime and moved away. He didn't hide. He didn't cut contact with society. He stayed right there in Indiana, aging quietly while families drove past his house, never knowing the man inside had murdered a child and left her in a ditch. But it was what he did after the murder that terrified the community the most. When he wrote the notes in 2004, leaving them in mailboxes and on bicycles, he deliberately targeted little girls. The handwriting was messy and childlike. The grammar was broken. The tone was taunting. One note said he had been watching the girl for a long time. Another said she should be thankful she wasn't his next victim. These messages weren't random outbursts. They were planned acts meant to instill fear. Those notes triggered an FBI psychological profile that described the killer as someone who likely lived alone, had trouble forming relationships, struggled socially, and would probably appear unremarkable to neighbors. The profile turned out to describe Miller almost perfectly. But at the time, even with that profile, the case stalled. It was like staring into fog. You could see the outline of a suspect, but never the clear image. What the community didn't know was that law enforcement never gave up. April's case wasn't just another cold file. It was a wound that stayed open, especially for the Fort Wayne officers who grew up in the city. Some detectives admitted they joined law enforcement because of April's story. They wanted to be the ones who solved it. They wanted closure for her family. Every couple of years, the case would resurface in meetings, detectives spreading out photos, re-examining old interviews, and hoping new technology would give them a breakthrough. That breakthrough came from a young genealogist working with the new DNA technique. She studied the family tree built from the genetic match and narrowed it down to a handful of people. As she refined it, the number shrank. Eventually, only 2 brothers in their late 50s fit the criteria. Both lived in Indiana. Both were possible suspects, but only one matched the general age range, location, and behavioral pattern they believed the killer would have. Once surveillance began, detectives watched Miller closely. They observed his routines, his quiet movements, the way he avoided neighbors, and the lack of visitors to his home. They waited for him to throw away something usable, anything with DNA. When he tossed a plastic bag into his trash can, they secured it the moment they legally could. Inside that bag was the DNA sample that would punch through 30 years of uncertainty. When detectives sat across from Miller after the match came back, they expected a struggle. They expected denial. Instead, they found a man who seemed almost resigned. Not emotional, not panicked, just a man who knew the game was over. He admitted everything with a level of detail that made investigators sick. He described April's last moments without flinching. For him, it was memory. For them, it was a nightmare finally spoken out loud. After his confession, news spread fast. Reporters flooded the area. People drove past Miller's rundown house just to stare at the place where a child killer had lived unnoticed for decades. Parents who had grown up in the 1980s, who remembered the fear that swept through the city after April's murder, now had children of their own. Many said they cried when they heard the news, not just for April, but because they realized the man who terrorized their childhood had been right there among them. April's mother and sister spoke carefully to the media. They had waited 30 years for justice, and although they were grateful, they were also exhausted. The wound had never healed. Knowing who the killer was didn't erase the terror April experienced. It didn't erase the years of not knowing. It didn't erase the pain. But it did close the chapter that had been open for far too long. During court proceedings, Miller sat silently, staring at the floor, rarely lifting his eyes. He didn't fight the charges. He didn't try to argue. He pleaded guilty to murder and child molestation. When the judge asked him if he had anything to say before sentencing, he simply said, no apology, no explanation, nothing. He was sentenced to life in prison. For many people, that sentence was the only thing that allowed them to sleep peacefully again. The monster was finally locked away, but the deeper impact of the case stretched far beyond Indiana. April's story became one of the first widely discussed examples of how genetic genealogy could solve crimes long considered unsolvable. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied the case. They realized that even the most calculated criminals could be traced through something they didn't even know existed in 1988. distant relatives sharing DNA online. This new investigative tool wouldn't just catch killers. It would reshape cold case investigations entirely. Families who had waited decades suddenly had hope. Detectives reopened cases with renewed energy. And for April's case specifically, it removed a shadow that had loomed over Fort Wayne for a generation. But justice didn't erase the fear of what might have happened if Miller hadn't been caught. Would he have acted again? Had he been watching other children over the years? Had he written more notes that were never found? Those are questions that will never have answers. Some detectives believe he was escalating in 2004, and if the DNA technology hadn't advanced, it was only a matter of time before he attempted another abduction. Others believe he used the notes as a way to relive the crime instead of committing new ones. Either possibility is chilling. What is certain is that Miller never expected technology to catch up to him. He committed his crime in a world where DNA was practically useless for identification. He never left the state because he thought he didn't need to run. And for 30 years, he was right. But science changed everything. When a case finally closes after decades, people often expect a sense of relief, a feeling that the weight has finally lifted. But when April Tinsley's killer was identified and convicted, the emotions that followed were more complicated. Justice came, yes, but it came wrapped in a painful truth. The world isn't always as safe as we want to believe, and the danger that took April didn't come from a shadowy stranger passing through town. It came from someone who lived quietly among ordinary people, blending into the background of everyday life. That reality forces us to rethink some of the assumptions we make about safety, and it's one of the clearest lessons the case leaves behind. The first and most powerful lesson is that evil doesn't always announce itself. We grow up hearing warnings about strangers, as if danger always wears a mask or steps from a dark alley. But April's killer lived in her community for decades. He wasn't suspicious enough to be reported. He wasn't loud, violent, or openly threatening. He worked a job, paid bills, went unnoticed. The truth is that some of the most dangerous individuals in society are the ones who appear ordinary on the surface. It's not paranoia, it's awareness. Paying attention to behavior is more important than judging appearance. Another lesson is the persistence of law enforcement. 30 years is a long time, so long that many victims' families lose hope, believing their cases are forgotten. But April's case shows that even when visible progress stops, the work does not. Detectives continued reviewing files, revisiting evidence, and waiting for technology to catch up. Without that determination, the new DNA technique wouldn't have meant anything. The case was solved because people refused to give up. The takeaway for families of missing or murdered loved ones is painful, but real. A cold case is not a dead case. Science evolves. Tools evolve. What's impossible today may be routine tomorrow. The legacy of this case reaches far beyond Indiana. April's story helped prove to the world that genetic genealogy could close cases once thought unsolvable. It changed the way investigators think about DNA, not just as a match to the criminal database, but as a map of family connections stretching across generations. Because of this case and others like it, hundreds of cold cases have been reopened. Some have already been solved using the same method. It's not just a scientific breakthrough. It's a shift in justice itself. Crimes committed decades ago, by people who believed they were untouchable, can now be traced back to them even if they never left a fingerprint or confessed to anyone. April's case helped pave the way for that new era. Her story also raised awareness about the impact of community fear. For years, parents in Fort Wayne carried the memory of what happened to April. They didn't let their children walk alone. They changed routines. They talked to their kids about safety in ways they never expected to. The fear wasn't imagined, it was earned. When notes began appearing in 2004, targeting other young girls, the fear resurfaced instantly. People realized that danger wasn't a one-time event, but a shadow that had followed the community for years. That fear drove many families to teach their children new safety habits, some of which remain important today. Those precautions are part of the case's living legacy. The lessons aren't about living in fear, but living with awareness. For parents, one of the main lessons is the simplest. Know where your children are, even in familiar neighborhoods. Dangerous situations often unfold in places we feel safest. Familiarity can create vulnerability. The second precaution is communication. Children need to feel comfortable speaking up when something feels wrong, whether it's an adult acting strangely or a situation that sets off instinctive alarm bells. Encouraging children to trust that instinct is essential. Another important precaution is community vigilance. In April's case, the killer lived surrounded by people who rarely interacted with him. He stayed withdrawn, isolated, unnoticed. While it's not realistic or fair to suspect every quiet neighbor of wrongdoing, staying aware of unusual behavior matters. Someone who leaves disturbing notes, someone who targets children, someone who behaves in a way that makes others uncomfortable. Those are signs that should be taken seriously, not ignored out of awkwardness or doubt. There's also a lesson for the online world. Modern children grow up in a digital environment that didn't exist in April's time. Parents now face new risks. Online grooming, deceptive adults posing as kids, platforms where predators can watch and choose victims without leaving home. Awareness and monitoring are critical. It's not about spying on children. It's about protecting them from hidden threats. Another legacy of April's case is the reminder that justice can take time, sometimes more time than feels bearable. Her family waited 3 decades. They lived through false leads, renewed hope, dead ends, and long periods of silence. Many families in cold case situations feel abandoned by the system. April's story sends a different message. Sometimes justice is slow because technology hasn't caught up yet, not because the case is forgotten. For families in similar situations, that message can offer a small sense of strength. The case also shows the emotional cost communities carry when violence goes unanswered. Even after the killer was caught, the relief was mixed with grief. People remembered the fear from their childhood. Parents who grew up under that shadow now had children of their own. The memory didn't disappear, it transformed. It became a reminder of how vulnerable children are and how quickly a community can be shaken. But it also became a symbol of resilience. Fort Wayne never forgot April. That collective memory is part of the reason her case stayed alive for so long. There's one more legacy, one that belongs entirely to April herself. Her life, short as it was, continues to influence criminal investigations across the country. Her case is taught in forensic programs. It's used in discussions about DNA, victim advocacy, and investigative persistence. Her name appears in lectures, articles, documentaries, and conferences. She's remembered not only as a victim, but as the reason countless investigators push harder on cold cases. Her story fuels the belief that justice can always be pursued, no matter how much time has passed. The final lesson, the most important one, is that children's safety is a responsibility shared by everyone: families, schools, neighbors, communities, and law enforcement. Awareness saves lives. Education saves lives. Communication saves lives. No single precaution is enough, but together, they create a barrier that makes it harder for predators to succeed. April's story is tragic, heartbreaking, and deeply unjust. Nothing can erase what happened to her. But her legacy, through science, community memory, and the continued protection of children, ensures that her life still matters in ways that reach far beyond the day she was taken. Her story reminds us to stay aware, stay involved, and stay committed to protecting the most vulnerable among us.